Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Investor Intelligence, brought to you by the team at the Property Mentors. It is your weekly podcast for all things investment and hosted by me, Phoebe Sikowski-Wallace. Back with me today is our investment expert, CEO and founder here at the Property Mentors, entrepreneur, author, just all-round great guy, Luke Harris. How's that for an intro, Luke?
Okay, Phoebe, that's probably the best one I've ever had. Thank you. Nice to catch up with you again.
Got to mix it up every now and then. So, Luke, the holidays are coming up. We're actually back to a time where we can go on holiday. So what better time to talk about short stay accommodation and whether or not you should turn your investment property or properties into one and how this can be part of your strategy. I'd say that most people have kind of gone on holidays and stayed in accommodation that was either found on, either Airbnb or any other short stay accommodation website. In fact, I think for many, it's actually the preferred option for holiday accommodation over a hotel room or a smelly backpackers. I know that was mine when I traveled Europe. I will choose an Airbnb over backpackers any day, but that's a whole other podcast. But Luke, having short stay accommodation is not just for people who happen to have a spare room in their house. It's actually something that people have as part of their portfolio and their investment strategies.
Well, I think the thing that is, there's actually two different ways to look at that. Investors will look at short stay accommodation from two different fronts. One is that they've got a property that they want to rent out on the short stay market to improve the yields on the actual property. The other reason that people will use short stay accommodation is for exactly what you mentioned before, is to rent out a spare bedroom or two, because that can bring in extra cash flow for their financial position. So sometimes people can get maxed out with their servicing for a loan, for example, because their income isn't high enough. But if you rent out your spare bedroom and you can get an extra $500 a month by renting it out a few times a month, that pushes your income up by $6,000 a year. And that might just be enough to get you into the next bracket for getting a loan, which means you can secure another investment property. So sometimes people will do that for a cash flow perspective for their own financial situation. And of course, people do it for the social aspect. Some people actually like renting out a room every now and then. And I've actually done it in the past. I've had international guests stay at my place in Melbourne and did that a few years back. But it was a lot of fun. You got to meet people from all different countries, all different demographics. And it's quite an interesting period. But a lot of people, I guess, for the purpose of this podcast, are really listening to find out, should they turn their investment property into a short stay property?
Yeah. And do you know of anyone who, because I never really thought of short stay as a strategy. It was more so just if you kind of had a spare room. But do you know of anyone who has a portfolio dedicated to short stay accommodation only? Is that something?
Well, there's people that very, very few people have successful portfolios that are just with short stay.
Okay.
Being mindful that short stay accommodation existed well before Airbnb. I remember as a teenager, we'd all get our friends together and we'd chip in for a weekender down at Margaret River or Bustleton or something like that down in the south coast of Western Australia. And so they've always been around. It's just that Airbnb and platforms like Stays and those sorts of things, lastminute.com, all of those sort of websites have now made it easier for people to list and find the guests for that property. So I think the key difference really is for people to understand the difference between being a property investor and an accommodation provider, because essentially being an accommodation provider, you're providing a service as well as the actual building itself.
It's really interesting how websites or businesses like Airbnb have disrupted the hotel industry and the short stay accommodation market. But has the pandemic, given it completely upended profits for the entire short stay industry, did that result in many people turning their short stay accommodation into long-term rentals because there was so much uncertainty for a while, they could no longer capitalize on tourists?
Well, that's it. And a lot of people during 2020 and 2021 really were decimated in the short stay business across Australia and of course across the world. Was just absolutely decimated, and a lot of people found themselves in a very tough position where they were not only getting any income from those properties because they were relying on bookings that they had. They actually had bookings. They thought they were getting their visitors, and they'd planned out the next 3 to 6 to 12 months based on bookings that they'd collected over the previous 12 months. And so when those had to be cancelled, there really wasn't a great deal of support. Airbnb sort of offered to help a little bit and allow people to move bookings without penalties and things like that. But it was very, very difficult. And a lot of people that have got more than one property were really stuck financially. And the issue with that is that also not being able to get that income from people traveling, they're also trying to list their properties back on the long-term market in a period that people just didn't want to move. People didn't want to commit. They were uncertain and unsure about their work situation. So people don't want to sign a new lease if they're not sure if they're even going to have a job next month. So it was very, very tough for a lot of people. And I guess this is the things that you've got to have a bit of an appetite for risk to put a property in your portfolio into the short stay market. And it's certainly something that it's not for the faint-hearted. You can have a higher yield and a higher return in a perfect world, but at the same time, there can be plenty of uncertainty that goes with that. You need to be able to account for higher vacancies, and if something like COVID happens, or if there's other disruptions that happen in the marketplace, you need to be able to tolerate some pretty extended vacancies.
You touched on a couple of things there that I want to talk about later, but let's get into sort of strategy. What are some of the common reasons a short stay rental would fit into an investment strategy or portfolio? What are some of the draws of that?
If you've got a property that's in a good area for that, so if you've got something that's close to a beach, something that's close to a city centre, something that's close to a business park, for example, you get a regional business park, or something that's out of the city but close to where a lot of businesses are. But you need to have something that appeals in the property itself. A lot of people try and turn a house in the suburbs into an Airbnb, but there's got to be a reason why people want to travel to that area in the first place and stay in that property. So this is where you'll find a lot of properties on the Gold Coast and in Noosa and places like Margaret River and down in Torquay and Sorrento in Melbourne and places like that people want to travel to and actually enjoy. Same thing also applies in areas like Paran and South Yarra in Melbourne, places like the CBD in any capital city really, where people want to go because they're going there for a reason. They're going for business or for pleasure, and that's the reason why. So I think you've got to have a property that's suitable for the end guest. Trying to make one of your properties into a short stay. Just because you want to do that particular strategy doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be demand for that. So there's research tools that you need to access to make sure that you can look at that supply and demand fundamental.
So one of the things you mentioned just before was high yield. So my parents have an Airbnb at the front of their house, and they live in a small country town. It's very, very touristy, kind of all year round, no matter the season. But one of the draws was, apart from the fact that, as you said, they get to kind of meet new people, they can charge for one night what a lot of people in sort of the outer suburbs of Melbourne spend on rent for a week.
And that's rare. It's a good position to be in, and a lot of people will use that as their investment strategy. And you'll find that there are a lot of people that are doing that, where you find that people maybe just need that extra income, and they've got a house that they can split off into a second dwelling essentially, or if they've got a backyard, they can put a granny flat or something like that. And a lot of people are sort of using that as their retirement strategy if they haven't built up a property portfolio, or they haven't built up their asset base, or even if they just want to supplement their portfolio income from other sources. It does make sense, and some people like the idea of just running essentially a B&B where they're not necessarily in the house. It's not bed and breakfast as such. They're not coming in, you're not cooking them bacon and eggs in the morning, but you've got them on the property. You can sort of see what's going on. And I guess the risk tolerance for some people is, well, we've got the land, we've either got the house on the front that we can rent out, or we can quite easily put a dwelling on there and we'll just oversee it. And that's a bit of extra money for us. If we can get, extra $500 a week by renting it out, or whatever the figure is, we can see it, we can do the cleaning, we can make it tidy, we can look after the gardens because we live right next door or right out the back. And from that perspective, that's something that's, a lot of people sort of like the idea of just doing that without necessarily building an empire of having 10 or 20 properties. just having that one property that they look after themselves, they clean, they do the maintenance on it, and it's great. If you want to go into retirement phase and do that for a bit of extra income, you meet some new people. I don't disagree with that entirely at all, and I think it's just a matter of how much energy and effort you want to put in. And I guess that from that perspective, that's a bit more of a passion project and a bit of a hobby that provides an income rather than a direct investment. Which if you factor in as an investor, if you want to factor in all of the cleaning, the gardening, the maintenance, checking tenants in, guests in, checking them in and out, doing all of the documentation that goes with that. Of course, running it as a business, you need to factor in all of your GST and all of those things as administration time that goes into that. By the time you take all of that away, sometimes it actually makes more sense just to leave it on the long-term market. So again, it's just getting that balance between understanding your numbers and whether it's actually profitable or not.
Yeah, it can be a good little side hustle, but as you said, it's more energy and effort than I think a lot of people think. It's kind of like getting a dog. Like it's great, but there's always a hell of a lot more work involved than people anticipate.
Well, exactly, and dogs are often cuter. They're a lot more fun
Yes.
to be around. And even though sometimes, I mean, my dog Jackson, he gets up in the middle of the night and you can hear him run down his little ramp off the bed, and he wants to go out to the toilet. It's the same thing with the with short stay accommodation. If there's a problem at 11 o'clock at night, somebody needs to be available to pick up the phone and look after that guest, because again, they're a guest, they're not a tenant. If you're a property manager and you've got an issue, they've usually got an after hours phone number for the plumber, after hours phone number for the electrician, and tenants can call directly to those people. Very rarely does the property manager have to take a phone call at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Now, if you're an accommodation provider and you're providing a place for somebody to enjoy a long weekend or to stay for a week from interstate, then they want to know that they can contact somebody at all hours. If the hot water system goes off, if the light bulb goes out, the fridge stops working, remember, you've provided a furnished property. So other things can go wrong other than the building. So not only do you have to look after all of the building issues that naturally will occur with a building, hot water systems, water leaks, things like that happen, then you've also got to look after things like fridges, microwaves, the Bluetooth's not working on the stereo, we can't get that working, or maybe there's an issue with the pool, all of these other issues, or somebody's broken a glass and they've cut themselves, how do we get a first aid kit? All of these little things that people don't think about that can and do happen with accommodation. So you've just got to make sure that you've factored in all of the components to it.
I'm very impressed that you were able to make a comparison then of a dog needing to go to the toilet and problems happening in your short stay accommodation. That's great, Luke. I love that.
Well, only because it happened last night, and Jackson, I tell you, he got up about 3 times last night, so he's very much a little attention seeker, that little dash hound.
Fresh experience.
Yes.
So then what things do you need to kind of consider for short stay investment property that differ to a regular rental?
Usually when you're buying an investment property, and I assume your question is regarding purchasing a property, but if you're buying an investment property, you need to know what the purpose of the property is. So if you're buying a property...
Yeah, purchasing and sourcing, by the way, yeah.
So if you're looking for long-term investment, you need to understand what the long-term plan and the long-term strategy is for that. Now, if you're buying a place to live in for yourself, there's a very different approach to how you buy the property, where you buy the property, and how much you pay for the property. The same thing applies whether your intention is to put it on the long-term rental market versus put it on the short stay market. Now, there's things that you need to consider for the short stay market, such as making sure that if you're in an apartment building, for example, if you're buying in a CBD somewhere, does the body corporate and the owner's corporation allow for that? What are the rules around that? What are the restrictions? Have they had issues in the past in that building? What's the security like? How are you going to get access? All of these questions need to come into it. So you need to know what the purpose of the investment is in the first place. You need to understand whether it's for capital growth or for cash flow, or both. Now, sometimes you might get one or the other. Sometimes you might get a little bit of both. But again, every property that you add to your property portfolio has to be added with a specific purpose and intent when you purchase. So without knowing specifically why you're buying that property, you could just be going in blind. You might buy the property and go, well, maybe I'll put it on long term, maybe I'll put it on short stay. But there's a whole series of data that you need to research around vacancy rates and occupancy rates, and what the actual rental rates are. Are you buying in an area that's already saturated with Airbnb type properties? These are all of the research points that you need to cover, and which way you research will depend on what your ultimate outcome is. If you're looking for short stay, you will research those factors. If you're looking for long-term rental, then you need to research those factors as well.
And one of the big ones is the difference in short stay and regular rental is the fluctuation in cash flow.
Absolutely. I think that's the key takeaway for most people that are considering that, is to understand that you're going to have in most Airbnb type properties, and when I say Airbnb, I'm generally referring to short stay in general. But when you're doing that, sometimes you're going to have seasonal fluctuations. Like obviously, as you say, with the Easter holidays coming up, there's a lot of long weekends and big gaps where people will go away. They might have had very little as far as guests during February and March, for example. They might have had a busy Christmas season and school holiday season. Then it goes quiet through most of February, quiet through March, and then it picks up again in April. It depends also where the property is. If you're on the Gold Coast, for example, you might have a very, very busy summer, and then winter goes very quiet. So some areas are going to be different to others, but you also need to look at the competition and make sure that you've got something unique about your property that makes people want to stay there. And often that means access to public transport, things like views, having extra king size beds, things like that people are going to be appealed to. If people think that just by slapping your old secondhand furniture in a property and putting it up for $500 a night online is going to work, you'll find more often than it doesn't. So you need to make sure that you've got every component right to make sure that it's appealing to the end consumer.
If you wanted to get fit or start a fitness program, you wouldn't run a marathon if you hadn't yet mastered jogging. You also wouldn't begin weight training by lifting 30-kilo dumbbells. There are, of course, multiple ways to keep fit through a variety of sports and exercise programs. However, there is a process to getting into shape and achieving peak performance. It's the same when it comes to investing in property. You need to start by doing some self-assessment of where you are now to where you'd like to be. This would be your fitness test. You have to find your team of experts who will help you along the way. These would be your trainers. And learn how other people invest, including the mistakes they've made. Only then can you start to look at how you will achieve your property investing goals. Property Fit assists you with all of this. It's the latest book from experienced property investor, entrepreneur, and founder and CEO of the Property Mentors, Luke Harris. It's the book that will guide you through the groundwork you need to cover before you start investing, exploring all the ways to invest in property by helping you find a strategy that will lead to the ultimate goal of financial freedom. Property Fit is your easy-to-read, practical book including mentor tips and mindset insights, as well as proven strategies that seasoned investors or those just starting out in property will find invaluable. Visit propertyfitbook.com.au to purchase your copy and get your property portfolio in shape for financial freedom.
I just want to go back quickly. Could one of the benefits of having short-term accommodation is the fact that it could potentially double up as a holiday home for the owner for certain parts of the year? Like, what are the rules around that? Because I know that it's not necessarily you can't live in your investment property, but what are the rules around you occupying that space for certain parts of the year?
Well, the tax laws are always changing, so it's always best to get tax advice from your accountant. So I won't give any tax advice, but as far as the staying in the property, you're able to stay in it. If you're the owner of the property, absolutely, you can stay in your property whenever you choose to. Again, if it's available on the short stay market. If you've got a long-term tenant, you can't just rock up and stay for the weekend. That could get awkward.
Oh, really? Okay.
But if you've got a short stay property, then you can actually allocate some days of the week, days of the month or year that you actually go and stay there, or you can take the whole family there. But you need to be aware of the tax rules around it and make sure you've discussed it with your accountant first. Often you'll find that by the time when you start blurring the lines between what's an investment and what's for personal use, that's where the ATO really starts getting their ears prick up, right? So you want to make sure that you've got good documentation. You want to record when the property is available for rent and when it's available for personal use. So you just need to make sure that you've got very good record keeping and that you've discussed it with your accountant first, because a lot of people will find, we want to stay there for 3 months a year over the summer break and then rent it out for the rest of the time on short stay. Well, they find that if they're not declaring that, you might find if you've been doing that for 10 years and you're not declaring it, you could find yourselves getting quite a large tax bill. So again, make sure that you're planning things in advance rather than finding any surprises later on, because the tax office have got more access to data than they ever have. And believe me, they are scouring websites like Airbnb and Stays and things like that. They've got data matching services. They link up with other things, linking up with your bank account. Essentially, you've got to assume that they know everything that you're doing. So make sure that everything that you're doing as far as record keeping is transparent, and you know exactly what you're presenting to your accountant at the end of financial year. So it's not that you can't do it or shouldn't do it. It's more that you just need to make sure that you're documenting everything if you are doing it.
Okay, that is very, very good to know. So can having a short stay in your portfolio affect things like getting a loan?
Absolutely. I think the key thing that a lot of people think is that if I've got a short stay property, I'm going to get a higher yield.
Yeah.
And that means if I've got a higher yield, that means I'm automatically going to get more money, which means I'm going to get a higher servicing or borrowing from my lender. It's not always the case. Different banks and different lenders will treat short stay accommodation income differently to long term. So if you've got a long-term tenant in your property, you've got a lease in place for a 12-month term, the banks will take that at face value. Right? And a lot of banks will take 100% of that rental income. Some will take 90 or 80 or 70% of that rental income. But a lot of short stay income some banks will not even include that in your servicing at all. Some will take 50% or less, and some will actually take 100% of that smoothed out over a 12-month period. But it does depend on the lender that you're going to. So your finance strategy and your finance plan needs to be very clear before you start going down that path. So again, going back to what we do as a business at the Property Mentors is making sure that we've got the plan in place first. And then we go out there and discuss the finance strategy behind that. And then we secure the property. The property is the last thing that we secure. So we've got to make sure we're going through a proper process first. But we found a lot of people that have come to us over the years have said, well, look, we've got some properties in our portfolio. We've got some on short stay and we just can't get a loan because they're just not having consistent enough income. They might have a busy period over Christmas and Easter, but the rest of the year is relatively low. So the banks will look at the average over the 12 months. And it's oftentimes we find that it's actually the same as or less than what you would get on the long-term rental market.
Wow.
Without any of the hassle or stress. I had a property a couple of years ago up in Early Beach, and I had that property on the short stay market, and rents were increasing up in Early Beach, and they still are. And we did the figures on it probably 18 months ago now, and ran the numbers and looked at long-term market versus the fees we were paying, because we had an external company managing the short stay for us. And by the time we paid all of the fees, the cleaning fees, we could get some of those back from the guest. But by the time we netted everything out, it worked out that we were very similar to the long-term market. But over and above that, we had to still pay for maintenance on furniture, breakages on glass, missing cutlery, bed sheets that needed to be replaced every now and then, towels that needed to be replaced every now and then. These are all things you have to have them at a higher standard. You can't have stains and rips and tears and things. So you have to replace these consumables. There was also things like shampoo and conditioner and body wash and all of these things that needed to be upgraded and changed on a regular basis. So when you looked at the net outcome, it worked out better to have it on the long-term market because there was no extra work involved from me and my accounting team to deal with all of that. So we've now ended up putting the long-term tenant in there, and I believe we're actually getting a better result having a long-term tenant in there. And I'll tell you one thing, I don't have any phone calls or nothing to worry about. I don't have the short stay manager ringing me telling me there's an issue with the door lock or there's an issue with this, because when you're looking at short stay, what you've got to imagine is that you've got 365 nights a year that property is going to be available, which means that you could have dozens, if not hundreds even, of guests. If you have guests staying 2 nights each, well, that's plenty of nights of the year where you could literally have anywhere from 50 to 100 people or more go through that property in any 12-month period, especially if you factor in a townhouse in Early Beach where you've got 3 bedrooms and sleeping for 6 people.
Yeah.
You could have quite a lot of people going through that property, and of course that exposes you to more risk, more people falling downstairs, burning themselves on hot water, all sorts of things that can happen, and also damage to property, damage to walls, damage to carpets, damage to things as they're bringing luggage in and out. And of course, because they're only there for a short period of time, they haven't signed a bond, they haven't signed any condition report. So sometimes minor repairs you've got to make because you can't pin it on the actual tenant. So again, going back to that strategy is actually understanding the risk tolerance around these things.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to weigh up, and it goes back to that effort and energy thing, and I guess how attached you are to your cutlery.
Well, that's true, but it's not even even if you look at the cutlery issue, we've had it a number of times when I had those properties where 3 spoons would go missing, and you're thinking, why would they take spoons? Who knows? Right? They go out for a day trip and they take a spoon to make a coffee or something. But the thing is that the hassle of replacing it.
Sure.
And if your property manager that's running the short stay business was actually running from Melbourne, then they would have to go and get the cleaners to go to the shops, pick up 3 spoons, and they would often have spare cutlery that they would have to have locked up in a cupboard because things would go missing on a regular basis, and whatever they accidentally get put in the bin or whatever it might be. So clearly you don't buy expensive cutlery for that type of thing, but at the end of the day, it's more the hassle and every phone call, every email, processing the invoices, all of these things all need to happen, and that's all just time and energy, and you've got to make sure that you understand the concept of time is money.
Yeah,
and a lot of people, they look at the yield that they might get on a short stay property, but they don't factor in any of their time. And if you look at what your hourly rate is during business hours, and then let's say you pay yourself time and a half after hours, right? You've got to factor in what is it worth to you to have your evenings to yourself and to have your weekends to yourself. And if you don't care about those things, well then say, okay, well my time at 11 o'clock at night is worth X dollars per hour. My time on a Sunday morning is worth X amount of dollars per hour. And then you quickly realize that, hey, I'm not actually making a profit here. Now that's if you're managing it yourself. If you've got a third party company, the fees can be up to 25% of the fee, of the booking fee. So 20 to 25% fee that comes straight off the top. And if the property hasn't been rented out for a week and you get a booking for a long weekend, the fee's still 25%. So there's no certainty or guarantee that you're going to get a booking for the vacancy periods.
Okay. And then if you have regular tenants, they can steal their own cutlery. Anyway, I'll get off the cutlery talk now. So to wrap up, you have a chapter in Property Fit dedicated to this topic, and there's a line in it. It's actually the last sentence of the chapter saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Can you talk to that a little bit for me?
That's one of my favorite self-taught quotes, I guess. I sort of came up with that a long time ago. I'm sure somebody else has come up with that at some point, but I've used that in many areas of my life, specifically with property investing. But for short stay accommodation, it applies especially because there is a lot of talk about a short stay property, and there's TV shows about people that they compete with short stay properties. I can't remember the name, but there's a show that was quite interesting to watch where they're competing about who can present the best property, and some of them have got different themes and things like that. But essentially, just because you can doesn't mean you should, means that people, I guess, think that property investing itself, just buying a property, putting a tenant in it, is boring. And over on the flip side, they look at short stay accommodation and it appears sexy. It looks fun. There's TV shows about it. I can put my own style into the property and decorate it the way I want to, and I can show off to everybody that I've got this mini hotel. And there are people that do that and they do it really well. But just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that is where people have taken over the emotional side of it too much. And they're saying, well, I want to have this little mini hotel. I want to be an accommodation provider. I want people to come and stay in my place and pay me for the privilege. And a lot of people like that because that's an emotional connection to the property. Now, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Essentially means that, well, maybe you can do that and maybe you can make a little bit of extra money. And what you need to understand is comparing side by side with long-term versus short stay, understanding the numbers first. Now, I would say for the time, energy and effort, if you factor in your own time, you'll find a lot of the time that properties just don't stack up for short stay. And there are plenty of properties that do, and there are plenty of people out there making money from that. But that doesn't mean that everybody is.
Sure.
I'll say the majority of people hosting for short stay accommodation are really there because they enjoy the fun side of it. People doing it as a hobby and making a bit of money on the side. There's some people that are making it a business, and they might have 5 or 10 or 15 properties that they manage and they look after for themselves. Maybe they look after their friends one as well. The gap in the middle is where people don't make money. somewhere between being a hobby and being a professional business that does this full time. The gap in the middle is where people don't make the money. So you
Interesting.
need to make sure that when you're looking at the numbers on this, you need to run it side by side with a long-term rental. Look at the costs, look at the management fees, look at your own time, and factor in the repairs and maintenance and replacement costs of all the consumables, such as cutlery, of course, but of course, things like towels and sheets and replacing beds, because you've got to replace beds every now and then. Every few years, you're going to have to replace beds. They don't last forever. Things like couches get damaged, all of those. You've got to factor in all of those things into the mix. And don't kid yourself. Do your numbers side by side. Make sure that you know all of your costs. Make sure you understand what the insurance costs are going to be, and even make sure that you can get insurance. Some places you can't get insurance for Airbnb and short stay accommodation because it's too risky for some areas and some insurers. So there's a lot of research and understanding to do. So I would just say apply that to your thinking, your thought process. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And it's not just for short stay. You can apply that to anything in life, and I really think it's worth reminding yourself of that sometimes, especially with investing.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, okay. So there's a lot to weigh up there. It can be an amazing strategy to, maybe increase your rental yield, but again, there's so much to weigh up, most notably the time involved in maintaining compared to, long-term rental. We will do an episode in future specifically on management and the sort of setting up of short stay, because there's obviously so much to consider and cover there.
Well, I think just looping back to our conversation at the start about renting out a room or two or renting out a granny flat in the backyard. Again, that's a strategy that I certainly don't discourage people from doing. And the reason for that is because if you're renting out a room in your house, it's not generally a huge extra expense. You're already paying the mortgage. You're already in the property. Yeah. You might even be renting. Now, you've got to check with your rental contract as to whether you're allowed to do that. But I know people that are renting that have also rented out a room on the short stay accommodation to get an extra, $70 or $80 a night, and it just helps them to pay the rent. And I've known people over the years that have had a house or a townhouse where they've rented out the rooms on a short stay basis, and it's paid the rent or paid the mortgage for them. So if you're doing that, then you're already paying your rent or already paying your mortgage anyway. And so by renting out a room or two here or there, that just helps with your own cash flow, but it actually doesn't take away from or add any extra risk to you, other than the fact that you've got a stranger staying in their house with you.
Sure.
Some people,
the elephant in the room there, yep.
Well, some people are not comfortable with that, but I think what platforms like Airbnb have done really well is you've got a review process. So you can look at people's reviews, you can look at who essentially your guest is before you accept their booking, and you're able to sort of do a little bit of vetting. Of course, there's still the unknown, and I guess there's certain demographics of people that they're not going to do it. I think my grandparents back in the day, they would probably not do this. My parents, they're not going to do this. But, you and I, we might be comfortable to do that and rent out a room here or there if we ever needed some extra cash. So from that perspective, it's certainly something that is worth exploring, especially if you've spoken to your broker, if you've spoken to Chelsea, for example, that we had on recently. And Chelsea said you need to get your income up just a little bit more. And if you need to get your income up by an extra $5,000 or $10,000 a year to service another loan for your investment portfolio, then maybe that's something to explore, because the risk of doing that, the financial risk is quite low. You're already paying your rent or already paying your mortgage anyway. So having some extra income coming through by renting out those rooms could just help you to get your next loan approved. And the only thing that is a little bit uncertain as to who your guest is. The difference, of course, if you've got an investment property and you put a guest in there, they're in that property on their own, versus putting a tenant or a guest in the house or in the property with you. But again, you can sort of, to a certain extent, vet the guest, and also the description that you put of the property is going to make a big difference.
Sure.
If you put in your property description, hey, this is a party house. If you come here, you're going to be partying 24/7. Then that's the sort of guest that you're going to attract. If your description of your property suggests that it's a quiet house and we're here to provide a bed and access to a bathroom, so we're not looking for people that are partying, then those people are not going to book your place in the first place if that's what they're looking for.
Well, you'd hope not.
Of course, there's no guarantees with that.
Yeah.
There's no guarantees, but of course, the way that you write your ad is going to make a big difference as well. So there's little things that you can do. Again, I've done it previously and I would say 90%, 95% of the experiences were positive. There has been some horror stories, and I'll tell you some of those offline. They're not for this podcast, but at the end of the day, weigh up the risks for yourself. And again, it doesn't hurt to try these things out.
Maybe we make another podcast where I can talk about why I don't like backpackers and you can talk about the horror stories of your short stay.
Absolutely.
Well, if you would like to know any more about us here at The Property Mentors, you can check out our website, thepropertymentors.com.au. Make sure to follow us on Instagram. Both the podcast and The Property Mentors handles are linked in our show notes, along with all of our other socials, including a link to our blog. Guys, if you are ready to take your investing seriously and want to enhance your educational readiness, the best way to do that is with Luke's latest book, Property Fit, and you can get yourself a copy of that at propertyfitbook.com.au. There's also a heap of other information about what we've talked about today to do with short stay in that chapter that I was referring to before. If you found this episode or any of our episodes helpful, please make sure to share and leave a rating, as it helps us reach more people on their investing journeys, and also subscribe to be notified when the episodes drop. As always, thank you so much for listening, and Luke, as always, thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe. Have a great weekend.